Hello everyone. Miss Rojas here. So, as promised, here's the slideshow for the discussion of the rest of Chapter 3. So, please make sure to take notes for this presentation. And instead of doing reading notes, you will turn these in as part of your Chapter 3 notes. Okay, and since it is a presentation, usually when I do these recorded presentations, I will probably do a mini quiz in class, very similar to the one that we had before. So today we are going to be looking at federalism and the different types of grants and some court cases to kind of, again, discuss this balance of power between national and state governments and how this trend, right? We have this trend, how it's changed throughout the years of this government. So we're going to start off with looking at the exclusive and concurrent powers of the national and states government to kind of help explain the negotiations over the balance of power between the two levels. So we're going to look at enumerated powers, reserved powers, and concurrent powers. So right now we're going to go over some examples of how federalism is shown in the Constitution. And just to start off, the framers and the founders kind of wanted to break away from that fear of uncontrollable power and this authoritative power that people had. And it was valid, right? Since they did leave Britain, where we had this uncontrollable power. And one phrase that they wanted to show in the Constitution to kind of help unify the country and change the perception of citizens who had greater loyalty to their states than the country was this phrase, to form a more perfect union, right? And there was the compromise between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists to have that phrase in the Constitution and all the other articles that came after that, because it was a general opinion. Although there were some differences and debates, the founders realized that a unitary government was not feasible, meaning just having one branch. Remember, if we could say a House of Representatives, there wasn't this 3-branch government. It was just one branch. And that wasn't working out, as we saw. And also, Confederate government didn't work. We had all these states trying to figure everything out together, but there was no central government to kind of enforce what they needed to do to make sure that union was helpful. So they decided that federalism is the best option for the country. But again, just to note that the actual word, and I'm doing air quotes here, federalism is not mentioned in the Constitution. So now we're going to look at some specific examples of showing this relationship of federalism between the state and national government, and one being Article 4, that addresses the state's obligations to each other, right? We have examples of the full faith and credit recognized by states, meaning that documents issued in one state are valid in all states, right? So we have driver's license. I can drive with my California license in Florida or in New York. We have marriage and divorce certificates. If I'm married in Wisconsin, that doesn't mean I can remarry someone in California. And birth and death certificates, right? They're valid in all these different states, although they might come from a different state. We also have the idea of an extradition, right? If a crime happens in one state and the person flees, a law enforcement of another state is obligated to return that accused person to the state where the crime was committed. So, for example, I steal a bunch of Disney plushies from California Disney store, at Disneyland, and then I escape, and there's a warrant for me, and I'm in North Dakota, and they find me my warrant there. I had to go back to California, right? They take me back to California. We also have privileges and immunities, right? So states should not discriminate against non-residents, right? Generally, we should always apply the fundamental rights guaranteed for all people. So people that came from maybe from Tennessee or from Maine cannot be discriminated just because they're from Maine or Tennessee here in California. There are a few exceptions, right? One, noting that maybe you guys are kind of seeing now when you're doing your college apps, is out-of-state tuition for colleges and universities, which, by the way, UC system here in California is great, and a lot of people do come out of state to come to our universities here, but they have to pay an out-of-state tuition. Also, taxes on non-residents, right? And this example can usually be seen when you're getting hotel rooms, right? So if next time, if you're in a hotel in a different state, you can check the invoice at the bottom, and there will be taxes for non-residents. Another example being hunting licenses are usually more expensive for non-residents. The next article that we have that kind of discusses this relationship between central and state governments is the supremacy clause, right? This states that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and it is superior to all state and local law. So this one kind of like, I guess you would say this one would always win. So for example, if it was, so these are acts of Congress and treaties, right? So if we have a state constitution, then the acts of Congress and treaties would win. Or if we would have state statutes, then the acts of Congress and treaties would win. Or if we have city and county charters and ordinances, then the acts of Congress and treaties would win. We finally have the 10th Amendment, and these are the reserved powers to the state, right? These are powers not specifically delegated to the national government that are written in the Constitution, and they are reserved to the states. These would be considered parts of the Bill of Rights, right? Because that was something that the Anti-Federalists say, hey, the state rights are not here, our personal rights are not here, we got to list them. So in my next slide, you will see. So we have here the federal system, right? We have all these different rights depending on state, federal, or both. So powers of national government, these would be known as delegated or enumerated powers, right? That word enumerated, when we were talking about the Constitution and enumerated rights for Congress, the ones that they get to decide, right? So these enumerated powers for the national government. We also have powers of state government reserved, and these are known as reserved powers, right? Oh, another word, I guess, for national government would be delegated, but you can also use enumerated. We have these reserved powers that belong to the state government. And finally, we have these powers that are concurrent. These are both shared by the federal and state government. So delegated powers are aka enumerated powers, aka express powers. Wow, there's even another one. They are written in the Constitution, and they're granted to the federal government. So we have some of the examples would be the National Industry Recovery Act of 1933 with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He brought in the expansion of federal powers as a means to stimulate the economy during the Great Depression. Right? We also have state powers, right? The state, an example being the state legalization of marijuana, right? We have those and the debate about legalization of marijuana, and those states have that power to choose that. So take a moment. I feel it'd be really helpful to copy down this Venn diagram in your notes. Okay. Now we have now we're going to be discussing the distribution of power between federal and state governments, right? And how it meets society, depends on society's changes and how federalism is kind of looked at from grants, incentives, and aid programs. So looking at the money involved, right? That relationship consistent with the money. And so we're going to be looking at different types of revenue sharing, mandates, and different types of grants. So to kind of start off, federalism, again, is a system of shared power between units of government. So we as people are subject to federal, state, county, and city laws and ordinances and taxes. So we have this sharing, right? Federal revenue sharing. So usually taxes collected at the federal level, the ones that the national government collect, are then trickled down and distributed to state and local governments through different types of grant programs. So, which groups or states would be more likely to support federal revenue sharing programs? Some might say, and usually probably poorer states could benefit from these programs because they contribute a smaller portion of federal income tax since they're not earning as much, but they do receive a greater portion of the funds for federal programs because they do need those resources. And we do have some people that might argue that this is income redistribution and it's not fair because we have more money and why are we going to give it to the poor? But others could argue that if the lower class or people of lower socioeconomic level are better off, it's better for everyone. There's better health and education leads to a more productive society, right? So it depends, again, back to how we think about political theory, right? Again, with my boys Rousseau and Hobbes and even Nietzsche. I haven't mentioned him here in this class, but yeah. And so we're going to take a look at different types of federalism, right? We have these different ideas. For example, we're going to look at fiscal federalism. So this one kind of discusses and specifically addresses how economics have impacted the increase in power of the national government by providing funding for programs on the state and local level. So hold on, let me get this cake out, okay? So we have these programs for federalism, right? So fiscal, depending on economics and the money, of how we can help provide funding for state and local level. So there's two different ways that we can kind of look at this, right? We can look at it of dual federalism, right? Where state and national government remain supreme within their own spheres in regards of their power and responsibility. So it's really separated. It's like national powers, you guys are going to give us foreign and military policy, postal service, monetary policy, right? So one layer of a cake. And then we have state powers. They're going to do school, law enforcement, and infrastructure, right? We have this clear shift that has taken where much of the funding for state and local projects comes from the national government. But it's separated, right? It's based on, there's this clear definition of, okay, who has these powers and who gets to decide what to do. And so we have different levels of government are involved, different layers of cake. Okay, so we've separated and we've made a clear distinction of who has which powers. Then we have cooperative federalism, right? Our marble cake, it's all mixed up. We have states and national government share powers and responsibilities. So, for example, we could have education, right, as an example. Federal standards are established, but states have authority to carry them out, right? So, we'll talk about that a little bit later. And we also have highway construction, right? So states have been responsible for making sure that our highways and infrastructure are upkept. But since the creation of the interstate highway system, right, we have these highways that go through different types of states, national involvement has been essential. So again, our layered cake is an illustration to understand that each level of government has its own separate powers. And our marble cake is an illustration to understand that the levels of government have mixed together their power and responsibility. And again, just to kind of emphasize again, the cooperative federalism, we have these shared costs, right? All levels contribute to this. We also have the establishment of federal guidelines, right? Money from the federal government comes with some strings attached. If you're going to take this government, then these are some of the rules you have to follow. And we also have this shared administration, right? We have input from both the local and state government and have increased, right, for the development of regulations and imposing mandates. So it's a shared responsibility, and the state and local governments get to kind of have a say as well with the mandates. So we have these grants and aid, and these grants and aid are funds that are approved by Congress, right? And so we also have different types of grants that the federal government do give to the states, and then the states do have that power to kind of decide where it goes, depending on what type of grant it is, right? So in 2017, I should have updated this. Wow. Giving you like a more recent year, but more than $694 billion were given in federal grants and aid. One example being loan subsidies, right, which is when the federal government pays the interest on student loans until the student graduates, right? And so we have the federal government that kind of, here's a chart of it, that they have they cover a wide range of policy areas. But one thing is that the states kind of also get to decide how it's spent, right? And so we have instances like, for example, the policy of No Child Left Behind for public education. These higher standards were set, and they were supposed to give money for that, but there wasn't enough federal money to help meet those standards. So a lot of the burden was put on the states, which it shouldn't be a burden because it's for public education, but you know how it goes. So as we can see, it has significantly increased throughout the years, and wow, a lot of it goes into health. That's crazy. So that's why we also have this issue of healthcare, right? A lot of countries have free healthcare, but we don't because, lobbyists with pharmaceutical companies. Woohoo! Anyways, me going into a tangent on this. Now we're going to discuss the different types of grants. Ooh, it's this again. Okay. So we have first our categorical grants. I might be pronouncing that wrong, and you guys know I pronounce a lot of things wrong, so I'm sorry. So this is the main source of federal money distributed to the states. However, for this one, these grants can only be used for specific purposes, right? That's why, or categories, how the states and local governments can use and spend this. So these come with some strings attached, right? And not necessarily like bad strings. For example, there's the non-discrimination provisions, right? Equal pay. Also, that the governments have to think about, the local and state governments have to think about environmental impact statements and community involvement. So one of this could be, an example of this could be kind of like the Head Start program, right? Where states have to use the money for Head Start programs, like early education and whatnot. And so, yeah, another example of this is the crossover sanctions, right? This could be another example of strings attached. Sanctions would be using federal dollars in one program to influence state and local policies in another, right? So kind of discussing about those interstate highway constructions again. We have, I can't go back, my bad. We were trying, Mothers Against Drunk Driving was kind of advocating for states to set the drinking age at 21, or there would be no federal funding for roads, right? So states have the power to determine alcohol laws, but the federal government applied pressure in the form of money to get a policy change, right? So they were able to kind of influence that. So if you wanted this money, you'd have to raise the drinking age to a specific age, for example, 21. We also have the cross-cutting requirements, right? And it's a condition on a federal grant that is extended to all activities supported by the grant. And so if the state would violate one area of the grant, then they could risk losing all funding, right? So for example, for Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which bars discrimination in the use of federal funds. So for example, if a university is discriminating in one program, for example, athletes, then it could lose federal funding and federal aid in all of its programs. So that's kind of a way to keep the states in check, I feel. And so we also have these categorical grants are then categorized into smaller groups. And we have two types of programs. We have the projects grants. So these are competitive applications. And this is when grant writers come in, right? We have Race to the Top, right? So Obama's first education program was that states competed for federal funds by agreeing to implement and assess education programs. This idea was that if they work at the state level, then they could be replicated at the national level. So they're like, okay, if you want this, then you have to try out this program. And most of these programs were trying to, I guess, just better the system, right? Based on research. And then we have formula grants. And these formula grants are kind of like based, the need-based is dependent on population, income, etc. So it's based on a formula determined by the legislation. So some of these could be examples with Medicaid. We also have public housing and training and employment programs. And this is all based on population and income, right? Those are the factors that are dependent. And grant writing is huge for both the public and private sector. Money is available, but oftentimes it has to be found and asked for, right? So that's something that we have to also consider for our school district. Does our school district have a grant writer? Mm-mm. And then we also have a different type of grant, which is called block grants. And this is when the federal government, it's kind of giving like more or less automatic, they're given to the states or communities like just kind of like automatically in a way, to help support broader programs. So again, we have fewer strings attached, right? And there's more power to the state to kind of decide where to put those that money in which programs. And so usually these support broad programs like community development and social services. So some examples being community development block grants and local law enforcement block grants. Next on our agenda is mandates. Okay, so we're going to be talking about mandates. So these are requirements that direct state or local government need to follow to receive money and federal funds, right? So these are programs through which Congress provides money to state and local governments on the conditions, right? So there's definitely strings attached that the funds would be employed for purposes defined by the federal government. So they're saying, hey, you'll get this money if so and so and so and so. So one example being Medicaid, right? It's mostly funded by the national government, but administered by the states with some funding requirements. So it is a federal program, but the states do hold power. However, they have to follow the conditions, right? Congress has expanded these programs to include coverage of children, pregnant women, and the elderly poor. So that means that the state have to come up with more funds to meet these requirements as well. We also have education, which I will be discussing later on. So again, we have this political cartoon, right? In 2 words, yes and no. So sometimes states are kind of hesitant with these mandates. Like they need it and it's helpful, but then they're like, we have the federal authority, what? And then also having to consider that sometimes they do have to fund some of these, like the state fund has to fund some of it. So again, this balance of state and federal rights and this relationship. And now we're going to discuss devolution. Air quotes, evolution, right? So this is kind of discussing, let me see, here on page 71 in your textbook. We're kind of discussing about the devolution revolution, right? So this is a point where devolution is when the states, they're like, okay, take power from federal government and give it back to the state and local government. So now we're like, whoa. Central government has too much power. Let's see instances in which the state and local government have to gain some power again. So it kind of started, this devolution revolution began in the 1980s, right? We have Ronald Reagan, kind of this president who also believed in trickling down economy, which right now we have evidence that it didn't work. So it kind of said that, okay, few government, she said that we needed to get more power into the states. Few government officials actually agreed with Reagan, but the federal deficits, meaning that there wasn't a lot of money in the federal government, forced Congress to cut funding to state and local governments. And so that kind of gave more power to states, right? And then we saw in a 1990 poll, right, that 75% of Americans believe that the nation was spending too little on education and environmental protections. They're like, hey, why aren't we spending more on this stuff? This is really important, which is true, right? And so Americans wanted the federal government to pay, but also wanted local control. So they're like, hey, we want you guys to give us money, but we still want to set up the rules. So then, again, now we have in 1994, we have that the House Republicans call for devolution again. So federal government giving more power to state and local governments. And this was called the Contract with America, right? And this was led by Newt Gingrich. And Republicans have the majority in both House and Senate for the first time in 40 years, so it passed, like they were able to do it. So a lot of these efforts, then we had bipartisan efforts to kind of do this devolution. And bipartisan meaning that from both political parties. We have Republicans and Democrats. So whenever you hear that phrase bipartisan is both political parties are in agreement. Maybe all of them, but some are in agreement with it. So we have the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, right? And so this act denied Congress the ability to issue unfunded mandates. And so laws that were taking up 30% of the state's budget. We also then have another piece of legislation passed from Congress, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, the welfare reform. So this gave states more authority in distribution of welfare and Medicaid funds. So it couldn't really be mandated. The mandates that the federal government were giving were reduced. And then we have a different policy that takes place in 2001, which is the No Child Left Behind. But and then so they're like, yes, devolution, we want more state power. But then Republicans are like, actually, let's go back to the federal government giving us more, right? So they want the federal government to give more and restricting state power and policy goals, which they did it for various reasons, right? They wanted to loosen economic and environmental regulation because I guess some states were imposing more mandates, imposing more regulation on those, and they kind of didn't want that. Also in controlling immigration, setting health insurance standards. They also wanted the federal government to say more on restricting the expansion of government-financed health care coverage, stifling penalties for criminals, extending federal criminal penalties, and tracking child support violators. And I also feel this kind of has to do with who had the power in the House of Representatives, right? And so once they started doing this whole devolution process, giving more power to the states, and they're like, wait, hold up. We have the power, and some of these states are not going with what we want. Maybe we should just bring it back to the federal system, right? And so one of those that kind of impacted that change from state power to more federal regulation was the No Child Left Behind. And it's one of the largest expansions of the federal role in education since the 1960s. And then in 2009, we go back full circle. We're back to this evolution, because we have the rise of the Tea Party movement, and in which they want to limit national government again. So never satisfied. So now we're going to look at the 10th and 14th Amendments, the Commerce Clause, the Necessary and Proper Clause, and all the other enumerated and implied powers that are kind of in this heated debate between the power and the balance of power between state and national governments. So we have the 10th Amendment, right? And the 10th Amendment states that power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, or reserved to the states or to the people. So this is basically saying that power is reserved to the states, right? And this kind of helps provide like the general idea of federalism. We have this relationship between national government and state government to kind of help have this balance, right? So we have different instances in which these were seen in different cases. For example, National League of Cities versus usury, and the state kind of the courts rule that in favor of the states that a national minimum wage standard violated the 10th Amendment. So this was kind of, they were arguing the minimum wage, and the courts decided that the states had more power for that. And so, it was based on... So something to really consider, though, when we're talking about the 10th Amendment is that states do have the power to decide when these, they're not stated in the Constitution, as long as it does not infringe on the explicit rule of the Constitution and the federal government. So one example being the Defense of Marriage Act of 1996. So this was a law that declared marriage to be between a man and a woman. And so marriage laws are considered to be reserved powers, right, granted to the states. And so there was like, wait, hold up, did this congressional act violate the 10th Amendment? Ultimately, the U.S. and Windsor, which challenged the Defense of Marriage Act of 1996, was decided based on the Fifth Amendment and due process for all. So the court struck it down. The court struck down this Defense of Marriage Act because it was unconstitutional based on the Fifth Amendment. So the next amendment that we're going to be discussing is the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment states that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of liberty, life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And so that technically means and basically means that there is granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the U.S., including former slaves. So the 14th Amendment was adopted in 1868, 3 years after the Civil War ended. And the fight for racial equality strengthened the role of the federal government. When many states refused to uphold the rights of African Americans, causing federal government to intervene, which was essential, right? Because what's the purpose of the federal government, and what's the to ensure our life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And so we have different instances like Brown versus Board of Education, and even before that, there's a couple cases that were referenced in this case and ruling. That the Supreme Court ordered desegregation of schools, but there were many states that were arguing that they had the right to decide whether the desegregation laws were applied in their state. An example being Governor George Wallace's standoff with federal marshals, stopping black students from attending the University of Alabama. But again, it was unconstitutional. Unconstitutional, because any person, right? And making sure to ensure the equal protections of laws. We also have Obergefell versus Hodge, which the court ruled that same-sex marriage was guaranteed by the 14th Amendment's due process and equal protections clause. And we also have affirmative action cases can be kind of discussed in regards to the equal protection clause. And affirmative action, just in case, just for context, is practices or policies that favor individuals belonging to groups known to be systemically discriminated against. Laws and policies that help bring more racial equality or equality, not just racially, but gender, sex, background, everything. So really important. And now we're kind of a quick overview, because we did discuss the necessary and proper clause. But this one's known as the elastic clause because Congress can kind of stretch their powers to cover anything they deem as necessary and proper, right? We have this ability for Congress to do certain things, and possibly it's kind of one of the most important ones, because a lot of the things that Congress has been able to pass wasn't directly stated in the Constitution, right? There was nothing that stated that Congress was allowed to create the Federal Reserve System, but they did so, and they did so because of this elastic clause, the necessary and proper clause. So kind of going off that enumerated clause and the necessary and proper clause, there is a Supreme Court case, McCulloch versus Maryland from 1819, which declared the finding, and the ruling was that Congress has implied powers necessary to implement its enumerated powers and establish supremacy of the U.S. Constitution and federal laws over state laws. So making sure that Congress had that clause, the elastic clause, necessary proper clause, and the supreme law of the land. And so, can take a minute, take your notes, and pause the video. But essentially, for this case, Congress creates the second bank of the U.S. and Maryland imposes taxes on the second bank of the U.S. Right? They chartered the second bank of the U.S. Because before this establishment, people were just, the banks, individual state banks were creating their own currency and having their own policies. And so it's kind of like, think of like school lunchroom, right? We have one student, like we have a kid, it's like, hey, I'll trade you 2 bananas for that apple. And then another kid's like, hey, I'll give you my brownie for your ice cream. Like, we have these different types of currencies and people are just trading, and there's like no way of really enforcing or making sure that it's actually like equal pay, right? It was just based on these individual banks that were able to do this. And so there was a bank cashier, McCulloch, who refused to pay the taxes. And the question was, did Congress have the authority to establish a bank? And did Maryland interfere with congressional powers? And so what was decided was that the court held that Congress had the power to incorporate the bank, and that Maryland could not tax instruments of the national government employed in the execution of constitutional powers. And so Maryland violated the supremacy clause by interfering legitimate congressional powers. So here we're looking again at implied powers. the necessary and proper elastic clause, the supremacy clause. And we're discussing the 10th Amendment, right? Discussing the rights of Congress and the reserved powers of the state. Another case, however, a Supreme Court case that kind of, again, discusses the balance of power between national and state power was that of United States versus Lopez, right? And so for United States versus Lopez, we're discussing the Commerce Clause. And this again discusses that Congress shall have power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among several states, and with that of Indian tribes, right? Which you're like, wait, why is this one talking about this? So again, just to clarification on what the Commerce Clause is that it gives Congress the power to regulate all business activities that cross state lines or affect more than one state or nation. So it's not just foreign nations, but it's discussing about, we're kind of focusing on the several states. So again, we're dealing with state and federal government powers. And so what had occurred was, so for United States versus Lopez, we have, please write some of this information down, but we have that Congress had passed the Gun-Free School Zone Act, and it was an act to say, hey, no guns at school, because it's a school, and you could be charged with criminal statute at the federal level. Alfonso Lopez brought a gun at school grounds, and he was caught. He was charged locally and then federally under the Gun-Free School Zone Act. And then local charges were dropped, but he was then federally charged. And so the issue was that they were discussing if the Gun-Free School Zone Act was an unconstitutional violation of the Commerce Clause. And again, the Commerce Clause being that it gives Congress the power to regulate all business activities that cross state lines or affect more than one state or nation, right? So we're talking about business and deals with the balance of power between federal and state government. And so what was decided was that, what he did was wrong, right? Yes, because possessing a gun in a school zone is a criminal act and not an act of commerce criminal laws, right? That are specifically reserved for the states, so the states couldn't decide that. It was something with the federal government. So it was going against federal law. So we're looking at the 10th Amendment, which was legislation brought and made by Congress. So it was going against that. And I'm going to end it here because this is really long. Please take notes on this. And yeah, have a great day, everyone. I'll see you in class. Bye.